right, we are really glad that our next speaker is here. His flight was delayed, so he just landed, and so not only do I have his PowerPoint presentation on his flash drive, but I also have his car keys. So let's see, college professor and pharmaceutical CEO. I'll trade my Ford Pinto sight unseen for whatever he's driving. Let's see if we can get this fired up here. Okay. Let's see, I'll just do this. Oop. Okay, that's the top one here? Okay, good. Okay. Now, new to our stage this year is Steve Treff, President and COO of ProCare Rx's Eastern Operations. Now, Steve has over 35 years' experience in the pharmaceutical industry and holds the primary responsibility of directing teams and processes that impact buy-sell contracting terms, including client contracting, provider and member call center operations. He also manages the entree for pharmaceutical manufacturers to ProCare Rx's clinical team for clinical programs. He directs implementation of their web-based clinical applications and oversees formulary management, which is really a big deal, I think. Today, Steve is going to address a very important topic for us today, specialty prescription drugs. Let's welcome Steve.
Good morning. I did not just land. I actually landed late last night, so it's not that much of a rush. One of the things we're going to talk about today is specialty drugs. And as Brett and several of the folks had mentioned before, you saw the premium increases that are coming for the different health plans. Not surprising. A lot of different factors, as different people have stated, but one of the main things that's also important is specialty drugs. So I started to build this presentation, 642 slides, and I realized that 20 minutes I'd probably just be clicking, and I thought, well, what are the most important factors? And there's a lot of details, but what I opted to do is something a little more basic. You'll all have access to the presentation later, so I know there's no reason, no place to make notes, but that's okay because you won't really need to. A lot of it's just on the slides themselves. So one of the first things that really comes about is what is actually a specialty drug? Everybody's heard about them. I've seen loads of reports and probably didn't understand them, or maybe they did understand them but didn't understand the ramifications. So one of the first things I thought I'd do is, well, what's a specialty drug? The picture up there is really one from a survey of about 55 different large entities, and as you can tell, there's no consensus at all as to what a specialty drug is. People think they're expensive, they're biotech drugs, they need special handling, there's all these different things, and basically you can kind of look and see that there are 4 specific items that tended to fall out in all the different surveys. And I'm not going to go through them in any great detail, but high cost is one of the factors. Biotech seems to be a factor. The fact that it's biotechnically engineered, there's all these different things. But we're going to talk a little bit more about what the impact is and kind of what's coming. We call it the perfect storm. It's a situation where all of the drugs that have been on the market, you've heard about something called a patent cliff, where a lot of the branded drugs have all of a sudden become generic. A lot of Fortune 500 companies, a lot of analysts have said, well, that's great, that'll cause the prices of drugs to go down. And as everybody's seen, price of drugs have actually increased. So there's inflation, more utilization, and specialty. So just so there's a statistical base, there's about 900 different chemical entities that are currently in development that are specialty drugs. And if you want to think of a specialty drug, start thinking in the realm of somewhere around $3,000 to $50,000 a month. Okay, so $3 $3,000 a month can be an employee per year. $50,000 a month can be several employees per year that you're going to have to start paying for drugs rather than deciding what do I do with employees. So you start to think of, well, these are starting to get on my radar. So about 150 of them currently have been filed with the FDA. Well, filed with the FDA means that the FDA is now reviewing it for approval or not approval or more research or expedited review. All right, so let's take a look at the history. Here's the history of what the FDA has done. So if you look at the FDA's track record, the orange ones on top are non-specialty drugs. You know, just pills that you would take on a regular basis. The ones on the bottom are specialty drugs, whatever that means. All right, so if you notice, 10 years ago, skewed very heavily one way. Well, if you look at last year, we're now at the point of, we've now passed the threshold where there are more specialty drugs getting approved than regular pills. Right? For this year, that trend looks like gap's going to widen. So you're going to get more specialty and fewer regular type of oral drugs. Let's take a look at the costs. Well, pharmacy trend, and I gave a presentation similar to this a couple of years ago. And the presentation at that time said, we think it's going to be about 2020, where specialty drugs will be about half of your pharmacy costs. We're now down to 2018. So it's very likely that when you look at the bills by the end of the year, if you're self-funded or if you're part of a health plan system where they're paying the bills, it's most likely that more than half of the cost of healthcare for them will be, of pharmacy specifically, will be specialty drugs. All right, so let's take a look at several of the popular drugs. I know there's been a lot of news out about something called a biosimilar, which is supposedly a generic for specialty drugs. There's some things you need to know about that. That's what's coming out. And I don't know whether any of you are familiar with the drugs on the bottom. Those are the ones that are coming out very shortly. I think everybody knows Humira and Enbrel. If anybody watches any type of sport, they've probably seen Phil Mickelson with the Enbrel commercials. Humira's on a lot too. But those drugs are scheduled to lose their patents next year. So the thought process is when something loses its patent, a generic comes out and the price goes down. Right? Well, that's not the case with these types of drugs. These drugs are biotechnically engineered. Interestingly enough, we had a meeting with the folks who make Humira last week. And one of the things I didn't know is it takes 4.5 months for them to make Humira because it's a living organism. And as a living organism, it has to grow. Well, it's going to take 4.5 months for it to grow so that it can be put into an injectable syringe to sell. Unfortunately, there's not going to be a lot of manufacturers, generic manufacturers, who are going to want to take the 4.5 months, and you can't make it chemically. It has to be made through live organisms. Otherwise, it's not the same drug. So, with that being said, as it says up there on the estimated savings, the three of them that are on the left are injectables. For any of you who know Copaxone did go generic recently, there is a biosimilar that just came out. But the savings is only going to be about 10 to 15% at best. So it's not the cure-all in the financial model. If you take a look at the ones on the right are capsules. Right? Well, capsules can be made quickly because of their chemicals. Those, it's very possible that you'll have a 40 to 80% savings, which is very typical of what you see in generics and what you think about when you go into a pharmacy. So just know that as specialty drugs come out, the prices are not going to drop like a rock. They're actually going to go up because the inflation rate on these things are actually 12 to 15% a year. All right, so let's take a look at specifics. I think everybody's heard about Hep C, hepatitis C, as kind of being an epidemic and the things to watch. If we look back historically, hepatitis C, when we first had cure rates, started in 2006, really became to the forefront in 2009. At that time, it was costing about $12,000 at the top end to have a patient take the product, and there was about a 70-75% cure rate. It took about a year. 2012, new drug sets came out. went up to about $48,000, down to about 6 months. Last year, and I'm sure everybody's heard of Sovaldi, drug was about $95,000 with therapy. If they failed, they had to take it again. And it was about somewhere between a 12 and a 24-week therapy. And good news was there was about a 94 to 96% cure rate. So things have progressed at a much higher price. Drug just came out 3 weeks ago. Fortunately, there aren't very many cystic fibrosis patients around, but $280,000 a year for life. It's a pretty high bill. Okay, now the good news is patients that are on that, there's loads of assistance through manufacturer programs. Also, they're most likely to be fully insured. It's not a huge market there. All right, so let's take a look at hepatitis C. This is an interesting article, and I know it's hard to read, but basically the gist of the article, it was in the American Annals of Emergency Medicine a couple of weeks ago. And really what it talked about is it talked about patients that go into emergency rooms and the prevalence of hepatitis C patients that are hitting the emergency rooms, and the potential of that number being higher than the 3.5 million people that the government currently thinks. So, possible epidemic? Maybe, maybe not, but the costs are still going to be there. Anybody read the Atlanta Journal-Constitution this morning? Anybody? Okay, there's an article on Jimmy Carter. Okay, Jimmy Carter and his the brain cancer that he has. There's an article this morning about he's trying an aggressive form of treatment called Keytruda. It's a new drug that's come out, $180,000 a year. Okay, so good news is might help, very likely might help. Bad news is it now opens a new market to a whole bunch of other people because, you know, President Jimmy Carter, it seemed to have worked. So have to be careful with that stuff. All right, so one of the things that I really wanted to get through was, you know, where's the best place to put all this cost? Is the best place to put this cost, dump it into medical? In other words, small employer group, do I want to go fully insured, or do I want to go self-insured? There's pros and cons on both sides. So what I wanted to do is I want to take a little bit of time to kind of talk through the pros and cons in trying to make a decision. Real important that you talk to a healthcare analyst or an actuary. You know, some of the folks here definitely provide those services. But you really have to take a look at, within your own population, how many patients potentially are taking specialty drugs. What are the costs of those drugs? Are there ways to offset those costs of those drugs? Can you get manufacturers to pay for those drugs, in which a lot of cases they will? So what's the best avenue? So we'll take a look at a couple of options here. First option is let the medical side worry about it. Well, I think that's what Assurance did. They decided that's not the game they want to play, so they're out. If you look at Aetna, 17%? 17% increase from Aetna. I'm not sure that's the viable way to do it. But the pros are the drugs are covered under the premiums. So as far as an employer, there's no direct costs, at least you don't think there are. Prescription costs are clearly not generally reported to you. You get high-level overviews of what costs in different classes are, and you know, maybe some information about trends and things like that. The other thing you get is you get a promise to merge medical and pharmacy data together to get better patient outcomes. I go to a lot of finalist presentations for large employer groups and mid-sized employer groups and health plans, and one of the things I know is that the entities that are out there today have all the capabilities in the world to do this, but generally don't. It's very expensive. The trends don't really mean very much as far as patient care. So the mixing of the data to understand how to do better outcomes, they're going to leave that to ACOs and some of the other organizations that are out there. Okay. Let's look at the cons. Prescription costs are not generally reported to the client. So while you don't know what the direct costs are, you don't know what the direct costs are. The biggest issue is they are one of the key drivers of raising your premiums for next year. So when you look at the claim cost to premium ratios, what winds up happening is take a look at a small group, how many members have different disease states, how many members are taking certain specialty pharmacy drugs. Premiums are going to be above 16, 17%, will make this group 23%. So you're ultimately going to pay for it, you just have to figure out how. The other thing that happens when it's under medical, and we've learned this more in the last year than anything else, is that there's a lot of attempts for off-label use. Under a medical environment, a drug may not be working properly, so they'll try the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And you tend to get this runaway cost, all of which points back to your premiums going up. Okay. Final thing is, it's been notorious for many years that prior authorization structures under different health plans, it just takes a long time to get through the process. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you can get it in a day or two. Very often, it can take up to 7 days, which is not necessarily the best model. All right, let's take a look at the second option. Second option is you go through a self-insured pharmacy program. Some of the pros are that there's a very careful tracking of patients and utilization. Make sure they're compliant. While doing self-funded doesn't necessarily show the side where the pharmacy side cares what happens to the patient on the medical side, there is a connection that does work. Pharmacy side, when it's self-insured, does not necessarily have the risk of the patient downstream, but what happens is the costs are more direct and therefore the costs are much more controlled. So patients are worked through a structure of trying drugs that are appropriate. They're contacted to make sure that they're taking the drugs on a consistent basis, compliance. And also, the other thing is there's loads of ways to develop very creative types of benefits. Manufacturers, especially on the specialty side, have tons of dollars available for copay cards and patient assistance and things like that. Generally, in the medical model, pharmacies don't take advantage of that, while in the pharmacy benefit side, they do. And we try to take advantage of it every time we can. Take a drug like Sovaldi. Sovaldi is for hepatitis C again. It runs about $28,000 a month, or for therapy, yeah, $28,000 a month, $96,000 total if you add all the add-ins for a 3-month course of therapy. But the manufacturer has a $4,000 per month copay card available. So while the copay for the member may not be $4,000, there are programs out there that allow you to use that $4,000 to cut down on the plan side costs as well. Totally legal, and it's just a way to use benefits the way they're supposed to be structured. Well, if you look at that, the manufacturer just paid $12,000 of the cost of that therapy. And you can go drug after drug after drug, and every one of them has those type of programs available. The cons, just like in the medical world, you can see and have to pay what the drug is costing. So that's the downside. You get the bite of, oh my God, I just paid $28,000 this month for that drug. Well, you would have paid it next year in premium increases, and it would have been a lot more than $28,000 a month. The other thing that sometimes can happen, and you just have to work with your brokers and things, sometimes the medical side might go up in their premiums. So in other words, they'll take the drop on the pharmacy side, but they'll raise the medical a little bit higher to make up for the lost profit that they're really making on all the drugs. So you just have to work with your brokers on that. Okay? Any questions? I think we'll hold that for for the session later. Appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you folks, and hopefully be back next year and we'll see how this trend is actually starting to shape up, because there's a lot coming in the pipeline and a lot to work with. Oops. I'll just go ahead and grab this.